Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. We are in the third event of the new kind of event cycle of this year, and so far we've had 3 very high ranked vehicles, and basically the max amount that they said mission score was going to be required for these types of events, and also the maximum amount of distance as well. And this has got me thinking about future event vehicles and things that would be a lot more fun to see and also a little bit less copy-pasty and a bit more interesting, at least when it comes to its general playstyle. So in this video, we're going to have a look at vehicles that we've never looked at before, and basically a completely new set of vehicles that I would love to see in events, which would fit that mid to premium 35k every 2 days, shorter events instead of the ones that we're getting now, which are the longer ones for, well, let's be honest, kind of copy-paste vehicles with a few added bonuses here and there. The Jaguar IS is very similar to the standard one, apart from more different munitions, slightly better engines. Then you have, of course, the Baden, which seems to be just a complete copy of the Bayern, and then the 292, which is the most unique out of all of them, but still not great in that aspect. So what we're going to do here is just have a look at a bunch of fun vehicles that were around in the Second World War, or around that time, which would be fantastic to add in. Maybe not as event vehicles, at least in the current way that War Thunder does it. These would probably end up as Battle Pass vehicles, but for me, I would like them to be event vehicles. Hobart's funnies are something that you always kind of have to mention when looking at Second World War stuff, since they were a pretty integral part to a decent amount of it, especially the D-Day landings. We've talked about many of the vehicles in the past, stuff like the Churchill Avery, the Crocodile, of course, and even things such as the Sherman DD tank, where all of these would be lovely to see, since, we've already seen a few of them. And Percy, good old Hobart, or Hobo, as he was known, did have some other ideas up his sleeve with the good old engineering boys, but one of them I wanted to highlight today was the CDL, which is one you don't really hear too much about. This is the Canal Defense Light, and basically, imagine you take an M3 Grant, or imagine you take a Matilda, and you remove most of its armament, and then you just add a big old light to it. And the idea is you sit it on one side of a bridge, or one side of a canal or a river, and just shine a very bright light at the enemy to dazzle them and make them confused. If you've ever looked into a torch at night, imagine that, where it illuminates certain parts, but it also blinds the absolute hell out of you. Now, these weren't actually used that much. They were used a few times, especially when going into Germany and around those areas, trying to get across the Ruhr, but mainly they didn't really do too much. The reason for this is because they wanted to use the crews in other ways and didn't really find a use for the vehicles. Now, the interesting thing about the Canal Defense Light, especially on the M3 Grant, is it had a dummy gun in the top, and it probably also had a dummy gun in the hull. But what you could easily do is you could make that bottom gun a non-dummy and then just have kind of the dazzler at the top. This would obviously cause some seizures, probably, which wouldn't be great, but already in War Thunder there are so many different explosive effects. Instead of maybe creating a, shining light in people's faces, maybe they could just make the game a little bit wavy or a little bit shaky for a bit, or something weird like that. I think generally that would be kind of fun, and also you could put it at a BR where, the M3 Grant wouldn't take over the game, and would be at least a little bit of fun. One of the prototypes I feel like which is forgotten about for America is the XP-54. This is the Swoosh Goose, as it's known, or at least nicknamed, and has one of the best names of the Second World War. And this vehicle is a pusher engine prop, very similar to stuff like the Ascender, which we already have in game, but this one was completely cancelled. They built 2 of them, and also, once again, it's one of those vehicles which could have made something happen, but just kind of came around at a very odd time, and also, of course, the United States Army Air Force wanted to go in different directions. The idea of the vehicle to start with was it was going to be kind of a low-altitude interceptor, going very fast with its kind of Lycoming XH engine. It had over 2,300 horsepower and would be able to motor. They then shifted ideas with the idea of it being a high-altitude interceptor, especially since its first flight was in 1943, and one of the issues that was coming up was, of course, the high-altitude bomber or reconnaissance setup. This was a problem the British were trying to deal with at the same time, even though they didn't really need to, since the Luftwaffe was in a pretty rough place. But anyway, the XB-54, they added a bunch of cool systems. The pressurized cockpits got added for high-altitude stuff, and also they just added a bunch of weird and wonderful things to it to try and set it up for high-altitude engagements. And this was one of the cool things about a lot of these prototypes during the Second World War. Even though they didn't really get anywhere specifically, they were great at testing specific designs during the war, which would then be used on other parts, such as the pressurized cockpits, such as some weird and wonderful ways to bail out of the vehicle so you don't get chopped up by the pusher engine that's behind it. This vehicle also did have guns on it, so it wasn't one which was unarmed, like a lot of the other prototypes that people bring up. This one had two 37mm and also had two 50 cals, so this one did have quite a nice armament. The Lycoming engine as well did mean it could go pretty fast, and also just the design itself is really cool. I'd just love to see this one, just because of how beautiful it is, and how weird and wonderful this vehicle would be. We do have other vehicles that are similar, as I said, the Ascender, and also the Narval, but none which is readily accessible to the general public. With the release of a bunch of vehicles with dozers on them, one of the surprising things is we didn't really get a lot of the ones from the Second World War. And one of them, which is so iconic, at least once again from D-Day, is of course the Sherman tank with the bulldozer blade. This one has been, obviously, part of a lot of chats in the past, and also part of some games that I really enjoyed, like Company of Heroes on the Ardennes Assault, with their expansion, and Company of Heroes 2. The bulldozer Sherman was an integral part of being able to defend certain areas and create kind of little mounds in places. And I honestly thought when they added stuff like the Avery, they added obviously the scoops for things like the Soviet vehicles, we would get something like the Sherman dozer. Because it really wouldn't just be a way of being able to create a mound in a map, it would also give additional armor to the vehicle. But it just never came. It was very odd. In Enlisted, you actually have a bunch of vehicles which have like additional decorations on them, and also give that type of feel. Even a Stuart which has some teeth on it on the front. But for some reason, the M4 hasn't made it in either game with the big old dozer. It would be fantastic to see. I just don't know where it is. You could just have a standard Sherman with a dozer, and it would be fantastic. For naval, I once again have to mention the monitor classes, but this one we are looking at a different one. This is the Marshal Salt, which is part of the Marshal Ney class of monitor from the Royal Navy. Now, just as a refresher of what a monitor class is, imagine you take quite a small boat, and then you just add massive guns to it. Welcome to the monitor. Welcome to being able to bombard shorelines. And I honestly thought with naval what we would get is we would get a setup where that was going to happen, because they started adding in little AI things here and there on certain maps where you could kind of bombard and annihilate and then move on to the next thing. But then they just disappeared. So I'm guessing they just weren't ready. The Marshal Salt has access to two 15-inch battleship guns on a very small platform. It was a First World War monitor, and also it had access to two 12-pounder guns too, which are of course the 3-inch guns. It also had a 3-pounder, which was a 47mm, and was modernized to have even more guns in the future. This thing served in both World Wars for Britain, had very limited service, not because of the guns were fine. The issue actually was the engines. This thing was pretty unreliable when it came to its Vickers diesel engines, but it is just another vehicle which would be pretty hard to balance in the game, but would be fantastic to see. I would just love to see monitors, especially since when we think about naval, a lot of random vehicles have been added over the time, and a lot of similar ones. The good old monitor classes would give something slightly different. Let's just add in an extra one for a bit of spice. It's the Low, or the Lura, or however you want to say it. It's the Panzer VII, the proposed tank for Germany that never really went anywhere. Of course, we have the Tiger II, the Tiger I, the good old Panther, and even the Mouse. But the Lura, or however you want to say it, was a Krupp design of a new super heavy tank that would come around. Basically designed in 1941 to 1942, but never built at all. The vehicle itself was supposed to have all different types of main armament because it went through the design process, and every single design, they completely changed it. Now, why am I advocating for a vehicle like this? Because nothing really matters when it comes to what should be added to War Thunder. There are no rules. There is no rules apart from would it be fun and would it be balanced. And you could easily balance this thing, especially if you give it the specific guns. At the same time, it has shown to me over the years that the game is open to adding pretty much anything. Whether it be the R2Y2, whether it be the Tiger II 105, which is in a very similar situation to the Lura, or the Panther II, it is time to bring in a new age of War Thunder. Not just one which caters to supposedly realistic things, unless it doesn't, with stuff like the F-16AJ, unless it's inconvenient, like the R2Y2, so why not just open the gates? We're at that point now, might as well give it a go. With the fact that the Panzer VII has so many different variants, or proposed variants, you could easily have one as a tech tree vehicle, and also one as an event vehicle. It would be really cool, actually, if they decided to add it as a mainstay to kind of be like, okay, this is the new reality. It's time to embrace what we already have. We already have project ships when it comes to naval. We already have projects when it comes to ground and even aviation with the J6K1 and the R2Y2. Time to get jiggy with it and have a bit of fun. Make sure to have a look into the Lura. It is pretty cool, but as I said, there are just so many different variants of it. It's kind of hard to put in. But understand, pretty much every gun that Germany came up with during that time, the 105, the 150, the 88, the 128, and also engines, mainly the 1000 horsepower Maybach one, but also an 800 horsepower. Anything could be fitted on this thing, and also it could have any amount of armor on it you kind of feel like, which is why it's such a fun vehicle to look at, because it's your dream, and whatever you want to see. As always, hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank Schnitzel Stroker, Brendan Quinn, Vilneus, Character Fuel, Carrion Crow, Nicholas Richardson, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, B. Young, Opium Prime, Masonocrat, Lafouche, Alan Hacker, Sem Arslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.